Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Back in November of 2020, I read a book called The Women's Pages by Adelaide-based author Victoria Purman and knew that I wanted the chance to learn more about the book and Victoria's inspiration for writing it. A chat ensued and I loved hearing about Victoria's work in more detail. Fast forward to 2022 and Victoria's latest book, released earlier this year, is The Nurses' War, a stunning examination of the battle fought by Australian nurses against despair and death amid the carnage and bloodshed of World War I. Such a compelling, insightful and poignant read, and here to talk about The Nurses' War with me today is the brilliant Victoria Purman herself. Welcome back to the podcast, Victoria.
Oh, thank you, Claudine. That's so generous of you. You've buttered me up beautifully.
That's my job.
What a lovely way to start the day.
That's wonderful. I know it's been some time since the book was released, but I wondered, Victoria, if you could share your inspiration for The Nurses' War. Why was this story important to you?
I'm often asked where ideas come from, and I think this is an example of that kind of bowerbird personality that authors have. I heard bits and pieces about Harefield House, which is the house featured in the book, which becomes a hospital in World War I in England, in Middlesex, from a variety of sources. It was kind of strange. My sons went to Adelaide High School, and I was the chair of the governing council for a while, and I knew that there was a flag at the school called the Harefield flag. And it came to the council's attention because it was going to be restored. And I knew it had been donated in the 20s because the school had a relationship with the village of Harefield and soldiers were treated there. And after the war, the local school sent a flag to thank the people of Adelaide High for supporting the troops. So I always kind of knew that was in the background. So that just sat beavering away, I guess. And sometimes, an idea is sitting there waiting for you to tell the story. And this, I think, was one of those. And then I was looking at some of my husband's family history. He's fifth generation Australian, and his great uncle Bert. In his files that we got from the Australian War Memorial, there's a mention of Harefield Hospital. And then I put the two things together. Now, he wasn't actually at Harefield Hospital, but someone who wrote about him was a patient there. So I started thinking, what was this place? There's a connection to my husband's family. I'm a first generation Australian, so I don't really have any Australian linked family history. Mine's all European. I trawled his family history shamelessly to create some of their stories because they're my son's family history too. So I started digging and I discovered that Harefield Park in Middlesex, in the village of Harefield, just outside the village of Harefield, was donated by its Australian owners in 1915 to become a hospital for Australian troops injured in World War I. And the story behind it is incredible. And when I started digging, I just knew that there was a story to tell about the Australians who worked there, because the Australian family who owned it were the Billiard Leake family. And Letitia Leake was an heiress from the southeast of South Australia, Glencoe. And when she married her Sydney solicitor husband, they moved to Harefield. They moved to London with their family and lived in this sort of beautiful house. It's not quite like Gosford Park or, Windsor Castle big, but it's pretty substantial. It's a lovely manor house. And two of their sons were off serving, and they decided in that great Aussie way that they wanted to give something back to the Australian troops who were serving. So they moved out of their house, donated it to the AIF for the duration of the war and 6 months after as a place of rest and recuperation purely for Australian troops. And the whole place was staffed by Australians, doctors, nurses, masseuses, porters. Well, there may have been some local women, working in the kitchens and things, but they created this little idyll of Australianness in England for the Australian troops. And I just thought, there's a story there. It's hitting me in the face. And that's sort of where the idea comes from. But it's something I would say to writers, those who've written books, a few books, will know that sometimes you store up little bits. As I said, it's like being a bowerbird. And this was just one of those things that there were too many signs for me mentioning Harefield. And finally I listened to them, and The Nurses' War was the result.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant story. I think I said it to you before we started recording, but I love that this book was an examination of the absolute brutality of war, not only from an all-female perspective, but from the point of view of nurses, the people charged with the task of tending to the sick and injured, at Harefield House. It was such an up-close and personal examination of the horror of war. So I wanted to ask you, was there a particular real-life character or characters that you wanted to represent in this story?
I wanted to pay tribute to the 5 Australian nurses and their matron, Ethel Gray, who went over to establish Harefield House. Once it was donated and the billiard leagues moved out, the AIF assembled this tiny crew. It's the beginning of 1915, so if we can take our minds back, people thought the war would be over by Christmas. They didn't think it would go on very long, so they didn't think really they'd need many medical facilities. So 5 nurses and matron Ethel Gray went over. Matron Ethel Gray is a real woman, and I have used her name and the character in the book. I did create new nurse characters. One, because 5 nurses is a bit unwieldy, so I trimmed it to 4, and I followed their journey from landing at Harefield. They really had to build the hospital from scratch. Ethel Gray went to London to source beds and cupboards and desks and things, and the nurses pulled up carpets, black Japan the floors, especially in the operating theatre, because the blood would stain the floorboards. And they really cleaned up the house, moved out the furniture that was there, or moved it into other rooms. The billiard room remained for the entertainment of the troops, and so did the library. But these nurses really started from scratch, and with the idea that they might have 60 patients at once. But by the end of the war, 50,000 patients had gone through Harefield. 121 had died, which is remarkable, really. They were almost a frontline hospital, but when things got really bad in Flanders after Gallipoli, because all of those frontline hospitals, the ones right on the battlefield, the field hospitals, were loaded. They were chock-a-block with injured. So from Gallipoli and Flanders, for example, the injured were bypassing those field hospitals. There were no beds left, and sending them straight to Harefield for treatment. So that's why the nurses initially believing that they would be there to treat minor wounds, because no one had any idea about the damage wrought on bodies during the war. Previous to World War One, there'd been swords and rifles, and World War One saw the advent of tanks. More bombs than ever before had been used, so the injuries were much more devastating, and gas injuries as well. I wanted to tell the truth about what the nurses had seen. I didn't want to make it a misery fest, but I do believe in telling the truth about history. As much as I could, I put real injuries into the book. I did lots of research. I looked at old medical records. I looked at individual soldiers' files to see what they died of or what they were treated for, and I tried to use them in the book. It's important to look back and think there wasn't even antibiotics in World War One. So infection was a huge issue, and lots of different methods for dealing with infection were created in World War One, especially by women, to stop infection spreading. If a soldier had a gut wound, for example, basically they were going to die because the infection would spread, they'd get sepsis, and that was it. There's a reason why so many legs and arms were lost. It was devastating. And reading about the injuries to the soldiers was heartbreaking to me. In the years after the war, there would be men sitting in the streets of Sydney and Melbourne, homeless, as we would now call them, but back in the day they would have been known by other names, derelicts or deros, or that sort of awful terminology. They would hold up signs saying gassed, Gallipoli. Their health was ruined, their minds were shattered, and they were begging on the street. So devastating injuries, death rate of course too. So how could I put nurses in a hospital and not have them confronted with that kind of destruction?
Yeah, I thought that was one of the things you did so exceptionally well in this book, and just the despair of the nurses in seeing the kind of damage inflicted on the young men that were sent out to war. And I think, particularly from Cora's point of view, she was an experienced nurse. She had seen lots of things, but I think was completely unprepared for the level of devastation she had seen on the men as a result of that. But look, before we go any further, for the benefit of listeners who haven't yet read this book, I wondered if you could tell us more about the story.
Well, as I've mentioned, it's set begins in 1915. It does follow, you mentioned my character, Cora Barker, a nurse through the war. There's also another character, a local village girl, Jessie. I created her to show the effect that the presence of the Australians had on the local village of Harefield. It was a tiny little place, really, servicing the Harefield Park, and there was a butcher and 2 pubs and a little primary school and probably 4 churches. Varying denominations. So it's a tiny little place. Now it's actually a commuter suburb of London, so it's part of that big urban sprawl. Jessie's a local girl who lives with her mother and her brother. Father's gone, and she's a seamstress in the village with her mother. And I really loved her because her world is very small, Jessie. So she sees it passing by her window. She's never been to London. Her mum doesn't want her to go to London because it's full of odours and the miasma, as everyone was obsessed with the bad air. So they create frocks for the women of the village and surrounds, and that's her life. And her younger brother has a disability, and he's never going to go to war. And part of her role as a sister is to look after him too. So there's a very small world, and then it's suddenly opened with the arrival of the Australians. She starts to venture out. She opens the door of her house and goes to Harefield and decides to volunteer. And that does really open her world to the events going on in the war. I mean, everyone in England, every village in England was affected by death and by the deaths of boys they knew, but it opens her eyes to the possibilities of life across the globe and love and the horror of it too. And so she does grow up and mature through that process of volunteering at Harefield. And there were volunteer VAD nurses, voluntary aid detachment nurses at Harefield. So that's authentic. There would have been local women doing that work. And of course, the volunteers could wash men and bathe them and trim their, shave them, things like that, clean beds. It freed up the nurses to do some of that more intense nursing, which was so in demand from them as, of course, things got worse and the casualties grew worse. So it's a big team effort. But so we have young Jessie, and Cora is a more mature character too. So she goes in, as you said, she has experience in nursing, but the only gunshot wound she'd ever treated in Adelaide, where she's from, is a farmer who falls over and shoots himself in the foot with his rifle. Very different to the injuries she sees at the hospital. So the book follows those two women through the war, and it changes their lives in numerous ways, which I can't give away because that would be a spoiler.
Yeah, indeed it does. And I guess what was really interesting for me, particularly the narrative thread that's from Jess's point of view, was the sort of dichotomy of views about the Australian presence in the town of Harefield. I mean, you have people like Jessie and her family where they think, the Australians are, defending them and their country and are doing a terrific service, a wonderful service, and are indebted to the Australians for their service to their king. And then you have other people who believe that there are
all rascals.
Yeah, rascals and an omen of it, like, a bad presence in the town is what I'm trying to say. And, that they're going to, take the girls or to influence the girls of the town unduly. And so nobody wanted, there was a certain element in that town or society where they didn't want their girls mixing with Australian soldiers. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that came from my research. But by the end of the war, and to this day, the people of Harefield commemorate the presence of the Australians. It's beautifully heartwarming because 121 people, as I mentioned, are buried there. One woman is a nurse who died of the flu, actually. Every year there's an Anzac Day ceremony there, and Australians go over, but the people of Harefield really show their respect to the sacrifices of the Australians. And the local primary school goes there every Anzac Day and lays fresh flowers on the graves. It's just lovely. I've been contacted by people who've been to the Harefield Cemetery, St Mary's Churchyard, and have told me how moving it was. I was going to go there in March 2020. You know what happened, and so of course I didn't get to go, unfortunately, which was sad for me because I like to walk around the places I'm writing about. So I had to use Google Maps and all sorts of images and things just to get a feel. But there's a very strong regard for Australians there. But at the time, there was a sentiment in England that the Australians were a bunch of larrikin convict stock who were there and they were going to lead young women astray. There were weddings, there were marriages, romances between the Australian troops and English girls. And, it's no stretch for me to write the romance of Jess and an Australian soldier, Bert. There were weddings coming out of those relationships at Harefield. I've got a beautiful photo of one. I don't think the relatives were very happy. The fact that she was going to head off to Australia because that was a million miles away and they would never see her again. But it was also a class thing, and I wanted to portray that in the book, that the middle classes of the town and surrounds thought these rough soldiers would lead their daughters or their womenfolk astray in ways that we know now leave them pregnant, I think, and leave them in shame. There was a little bit of that in England, not specifically in Harefield, but I did want to reflect that all sorts of stories of ill behaviour were attributed to the Australians, but they maybe drank at the pub too late and broke curfew a few times. But God, these are young men and there's a war. Why wouldn't you want to have an extra beer if you knew you were shipping out the next day? Could be your last.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was fun to write. In real life, the Australian nurses used to do things like sneak the boys back in after curfew and leave a gate open and things and not tell people in charge, which I just thought was lovely. That little, that kind of camaraderie between the nurses and the soldiers.
Yeah, I love that story, Victoria. And I think the thing that struck me so deeply with this book is the mix of despair and hope amongst the nurses. And touching on what you've just said, the desire to live in the moment, but also to hope for a future beyond the war. And so I think I got a really strong sense that they were torn between devoting themselves to their vocation and longing for love and a life beyond what they were doing at the moment. And I thought you captured this so well, particularly as you said, their belief that the war was going to be over by Christmas. And then, lo and behold, they're still there 4 years later and nursing so many thousands of injured Australian men. So can you speak to me a little bit about that and why it was important for you to reflect this in the story?
Yeah, sure. From what I've read, now I've never lived, I mean, I was a baby during the Vietnam War, but it wasn't a world war. So from what I've read, there was that sense of the old rules don't apply anymore because the world is different. The world is different for them because, and I think, there's, having read recently a novel set during World War II in London during the Blitz, it's a bit the same. It was so random. You could be walking down the street or having a cup of tea in a chippy and a bomb would fall and that would be it.
Yeah.
So there was a sense of life was moving very fast and the rules had changed. For instance, it's a minor thing, but people stopped wearing corsets in World War One. Really? Why are we wearing? I can't believe the nurses wore corsets under those. And the bras became more popular because they freed women from the corset. The corset was actually meant to sort of hold things in place. In terms of relationships, Cora is a mature woman and she's in her 30s and she has known her whole life that marriage means she would no longer be able to work as a nurse. Nurses were single women, which I thought was incredibly unfair. Is it wrong for her to take a chance and find love and some comfort during that time that just dragged on and on and on? As I mentioned, Harefield thought there might be 60 patients at once. Sometimes there were thousands and thousands. They had to keep building. The main house was where the operating theatres were and where the admin and office people were. They built wooden huts, as they called them, as like a ward, and there were 22 beds in each. So as things got worse, as they started to know things are bad in Gallipoli, they built more ward huts. And so the place just started like they were popping up like mushrooms, taking over the whole of the property. And it resembled a small village at its busiest times. Life was precarious, and I think people would take more chances when life was so precarious. And Cora knows she can't marry and remain and stay a nurse, but doesn't mean she can't find comfort with someone. So that was lovely to write because I think the war made them lonely. The war made them all lonely, even though they were busy and with people. Such a tragic thing to live through. I can't even. I look back and think it's been 2.5 years of COVID, and we're safe. By and large, we're safe. There's a vaccine, and we can distance, and people have lost their lives, which is a tragedy, of course. But World War One went on for 4 years. World War Two, 6. As I was writing the nurses. Well, we were in the midst of the heaviest parts of COVID, and I was trying to capture that in my head about the drudge of it, how long it went on and how things didn't change, they got worse. Yeah, I think people would take risks in times like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Victoria, given the mix of real and imagined characters in this book, I wondered how you approach balancing fact with fiction in your writing.
I'm big on research. So I can't write characters until I know the world they might have lived in and the world they might have come from. But I'm also conscious that I don't want to put real people into my book as main characters. There are real people. As I mentioned, Matron Ethel Gray is a real person. She's a very minor character who appears at the beginning and has a few lines of dialogue. And then the real Ethel Gray, as I portrayed her in the book, actually goes to France and works there at one of the frontline hospitals and was highly decorated. She was an amazing woman. But I wanted to. The thing with writing real characters is you're kind of bound by their history. I don't want to make up history for any real person. Oh, I get really nervous about that. So what I've tended to do is to recreate characters in that situation and give them their own backstories. And that way, it's not an insult to anyone who's related. I've met people who were relatives of those nurses, those original nurses who served, there's no way I want to disrespect them by creating them on the page. The way I balance that is I do explain in my author note at the end of the book. In the Nurses' War, I've said these were the original 5 nurses, and I've created characters of my own to reflect their experiences. But it also enables me to then read more widely about nurses' experience in war and the experience of nurses when they came home as well, to try to know the end point. I knew where Cora would end up, and because I'd read about what happened to nurses when they came home. And sadly, many nurses came home. There were 3,000 who served in World War I. Many came home severely traumatised by the war and their experiences, never able to work again. We know about shell shock, as it was called then, in the men, but there was terrific pressure on the nurses not to say anything because they were guardian angels, right? They're on a pedestal, and they are meant to be almost sexless and personalityless, So they didn't talk about their trauma, which was especially made worse if they married a returned soldier, because they were then dealing with the trauma of their husband as well. You can imagine what that would have been like. So I read stories. I did some research into a charitable fund that provided some assistance to nurses after the war. And this was a contemporaneous account looking back at the requests, and analysis of a modern day historian, who said the after effects were devastating. Women couldn't work, had nowhere to live, they were homeless, they had their own mental health issues, they were in and out of mental health facilities, they struggled with alcoholism, all the things that the men suffered too. And look, to be fair, we weren't encouraging the men to talk about it much either. But I did want to portray that reality for the nurses, and from real experiences of the nurses that I've researched too. So it is a balance. But I think as an author, if authors are listening, the way to get around that is to just be honest about it and explain in your author note, at the end, what your process and what you've done. It is easier to create a character, for instance, and put a character nurse into that setting, because I can expose them to an amalgam of things that might not have happened to just one nurse in their life.
Victoria, as I said before we started recording, you have a special knack for bringing to light forgotten women's stories and histories, from taking events in our past and highlighting women's roles in that period. I wanted to ask you, and it might seem like a bit of a naff question, but why is this important, do you think? And do you have a sense that there are many more stories yet to be told?
It's so important to me because history is written by men. In the same way, history is written by the victors, right? Women have been there every step of the way in our history, but when men write the history, they don't put women in it. So much of World War I history, and in fact war history altogether, is about battles, tactics, strategy, weapons. And look, my husband adores that kind of history, don't get me wrong. And there's a place for that, obviously.
Sure.
But women were there women were there on the front. Women were there in hospital ships just off the coast of Gallipoli, hearing the bombs explode. We kind of think it's a man's war, and that's why we came up with the title, because it was a nurses' war too. It was a war for every woman back in Australia whose brother, father, husband, loved one had gone. They may not have heard bombs, but they were suffering as much as you suffer as much as your loved one who's away. So what I really want to do is put women back into those situations. And when a bit like the movie, I saw a clip from that movie Hidden Figures the other day about the women of NASA. Before that, I had no idea that women were doing the calculations for the moon landing. And why is that? One, because they were black women, in the context of this movie, but two, because they were women, and they were called computers. They were human computers. So men write the history of that, and it's all about the explosion and the firepower and the landing, and women were right there. They're written out, and I feel so strongly that we want to put women back in, because I believe in that saying that if you can see it, you can be it. And if we are honest and truthful about women in our history, we'll know that women helped create this country from settlement. Aboriginal women helped create this country too, from their establishment 50 or 60,000 years ago. But it's not just the wild colonial boy, Women have been there all along. So I do, and readers really respond to that because they say things like, and like I did when I researched this story, I had no idea, which is why it captures my attention. So it's very important to me. It's important to me as a feminist, and it's important to me for younger women too. I used to work in an office, and there were two young women who I managed, and I said something one day about, of course, back then women had to quit if they got married. And these women in their mid to late 20s, and they said, "Excuse me?" I said, "Well, that was the rule. If you were a woman in nursing, teaching, in the public sector, you had to quit when you got married." And they were outraged. As I mentioned, Cora Barker, my nurse, would have had to quit her job, her profession, if she got married. So it's a reminder of the past in a way that helps women of today, if I have younger readers, to think, yeah, well, they actually blazed that trail and they were fighting that. And so there was a really important discussion in the novel at the beginning, which isn't about the war, but it's about the nurses talking as women about other women, about some of the famous swimmers and actresses and women who blazed the trail and swum the channel and done all sorts of things, because I wanted them to be aware of some of those early trailblazers too, that even if they're, that I kind of had forgotten too.
Victoria, if there was one thing you'd like readers to take away from this novel, what would it be?
That women were right there in those historic moments of history. When you think about Gallipoli, and I've been to Gallipoli, I went there about 30 years ago, and I've stood in the trenches and I stood on the beach. And my only thought really then was about the boys who were coming off the beach, up those cliffs, and losing their lives in the water and on the sand. I had no idea that there were women in the ships waiting to treat the injured and tend to the wounded, who died also when those ships were bombed, attacked. And I wish I'd known that at the time, because I could have looked out into that water and thought, there are women out there waiting. There are women all along the way treating the wounded. Australia wouldn't let women doctors go to war, just wanted to add that too. So Australian women doctors who were determined went to England and enrolled in English regiments. The Scottish Women's Hospital was a place full of women's doctors, and Australian women flocked there too. They wanted to do their part, and so that's what I want readers to take away. Women have been there all along. It's not that we didn't. It's not that we didn't want to be. They were there, despite the battles to be there.
Victoria, you're the author of a number of books now, and I wondered. So the first time we chatted, I think I might have got you to give some tips for writers out there who are looking at publishing books. But I wondered if, given all your experiences to date, if there was something that you know about yourself as a writer now that you didn't know before you started.
Oh, that's a great question. And I have been pondering this lately. I'm writing my 19th book, my 11th single title, and I've written some shorter romances as well. Shorter or longer, you still need a plot and you still need characters. So it's just as hard, believe me, even if the word count's half. What I know about myself is that I write like a journalist. That was my first job. I was a journalist for years, and it taught me to be succinct and to leave things to the last minute. Because when you know there's a deadline coming, that's when my productivity increases. I'm a terrible faffer. And I'm not going to fight the process now. I just have to understand that's how I work. To finish off the novel that I've just submitted, which comes out next April, I wrote 60,000 words in May because I had to. I'd done too much faffing, but it worked. So I have to trust my process, I think. And so I think I'd say that to every author out there, a prospective author. Well, you're an author whether you're published or not. You're an author. Is trust your process a bit. I mean, I'm older now. I'm 57, so I've settled into my routine, and I'm hardly likely to change. I'm hardly likely to become a plotter at this point after 19 books. I wish I could be, but my brain doesn't work that way, so I don't force it. But so trust your process. Whether it's getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to write for an hour, as some of my friends do, that would never work for me because I'm not a morning person. I'm best in the afternoons. So I tend to do my I write full time now. I didn't until 18 months ago when I had to write on Fridays and the weekends. But now in the mornings I do my admin, I sort out, I do interviews, I sort out my edits and all those sorts of things. But in the after lunch, I write till 5 o'clock. And that's what works. And I don't beat myself up by thinking I should really be at the desk at 9 o'clock and have pumped out 2,000 words by midday and then, gone for a 10K walk and then, you just can't put pressure on yourself.
Yeah.
So trust your process, I think. And the other thing I would also say is read. Read, read, read. And it's something that I hear new, prospective authors say. I say, what do you read? Oh, I don't really read much. And I think, well, why do you want to be an author? Why? Why? It's, the other thing I say to prospective authors is go to Big W and see what's on the shelves there. And they say, I don't shop at Big W. And I say, well, you should, because they sell 1/3 of all books in this country, and you need to do your research about what sells. If you want to be in Big W, if you want to be in those stores, look at what they stock. So do your research, but so I'm rambling a bit, but I love giving advice. It's so much better writing my own books. Trust your process, I think, is what I would say, and that encompasses everything.
Oh, I love it. I absolutely love it. You mentioned that you have just submitted your next book. Are you able to give us a little glimpse about what that is all about?
I can. Titles to be revealed. I love the title. It's a story about two different women living in Melbourne in 1956 who enter the Women's Weekly Australian Cooking Contest. This contest was worth £6,000 in those dollars, which is the equivalent of, well, put it this way, it cost $8,000 to buy a house back then. So it was a huge prize pool. And I found the booklet of all the winning entries. A friend of mine runs a secondhand bookstore, and I've known her for 25 years. I walked in one day because I love her shop, and she just handed me this pamphlet and said, look at this. And I looked at it, and it was like all the winning recipes at this cooking contest, and I just said, oh, my God. And she said, I know. And that was it. That's how that idea came to light. It's, talking about where do ideas come from. So it led me to think about what would winning a contest like that mean for two different women in 1956? Because, it's post-war, but not quite. It's still within people's memories. I mean, there were still teenagers alive then were born during the war and might have lost someone during the war. Yeah. Families were a decade on from the end of the war, but that's nothing if you've lost someone. So is that gap between wartime and the 60s when things sort of changed and were liberated. So I had such fun with these two characters, Ivy and Kathleen, and having them imagine what winning would mean for them. It's really a look at women in the 50s.
That is awesome. That sounds so good. I can't wait.
It's so much fun. And I've got to tell you, the recipes that won, disgusting. Well, they're not disgusting, but they're just not what we would cook today. I can't wait to share some of the winning recipes. Everything had banana in it.
Oh. And pineapple?
Not so much pineapple, sultanas. It's interesting. Curries had banana and sultanas in it, and I've sort of talked about it on my Facebook page. And I grew up with European cooking, so it's not familiar to me. But people said, "Oh yeah, well, my mother always put sultanas in the curry because it lended a sweetness, I suppose." Because a really spicy, savoury kind of curry didn't suit the palate of Australians in the 50s. So I can't wait to hear. I always get such great feedback. I can't wait to hear people's more memories of the food they grew up with. So I grew up with dumplings and sauerkraut. So I didn't grow up with curried sausages and chops and veg, and then the shepherd's pie. I didn't grow up with those things. So it's really interesting to me.
Yeah, look, that sounds just wonderful. I can't wait for that one. Victoria, if listeners wanted to learn more about you and your books, where can they find you?
They can find me on Facebook, Victoria Purman Author, where I share my love of vintage Tupperware, and my dog, my golden retriever dog, Maisie, and my sewing when I'm not writing. And most often the books I read, that's me. Or I'm on Twitter, but as Victoria Purman Author as well. And you can see me on my website, victoriapurman.com.
Victoria, The Nurse's War was an insightful, exceptionally well-researched novel that I truly loved. perfect for fans of historical fiction. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you once again today. Thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books.
Oh, Claudine, thanks so much for having me and for your very kind words.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.